Many Magic the Gathering players ask the question, how do I build my first modern deck? The modern format of Magic the Gathering is a format like no other. It never rotates, and it has a large diversity of decks using cards from throughout a wide swath of Magic's history. But unlike other formats, such as Commander, Wizards of the Coast does not sell pre-constructed decks for Modern. Instead, they offer supplemental specialty sets with reprints of Modern staples, as well as introduce new and exciting cards to the format through Modern Horizons. But such sets are not decks. They are packs of Magic cards meant to be bought and drafted and then afterwards used as the building blocks for modern decks, or if we're lucky, create access to those key cards through lowered prices on the secondary market. So how does one build their first deck for Modern? What do you need to know about the format, the gameplay, the shifting meta as a player new or perhaps just returning to Modern? Well, the first thing you need to know is that just grabbing a winning deck and putting its list into your shopping cart is not the best way to start playing. There's nothing worse than spending a lot of money on cards for a deck only to discover you don't enjoy playing the deck, or that the deck doesn't do what you want it to do. Modern is actually a format that supports a lot more experimentation and customization than people realize, and with the new Modern Horizons 2 set hitting shelves, those choices just multiplied. So join me, won't you, as I guide you into and through the wonderful world of Modern Magic the Gathering, quite possibly my favorite way to play. Remember, as always, that the strategies and advice in this video is meant only as a guide, not hard, unbreakable rules. In the end, whether it is Modern or Commander or even Standard, the key factor is that you are having fun and enjoying your results. If you have achieved that, then you've done it right. I just want to help get you there. So let's begin with the Modern deck outline. The Modern format requires that your deck have a minimum of 60 cards, with the option of a sideboard of up to 15 cards. With the exception of basic lands, your combined deck and sideboard may not contain more than 4 of any individual card. Cards from all regular core sets and expansions since 8th edition can be used in a Modern deck. Cards printed before 8th edition cannot be used unless, of course, they were reprinted in a core set or expansion after 8th edition. Cards from supplemental sets such as Conspiracy and Battle Bond, as well as supplemental products such as Commander Precon decks, are not Modern legal. However, cards printed into the Modern Horizons specialty sets are. If all of this is confusing, the premier Magic the Gathering card search client, Scryfall, will let you see any card's legality for all formats, as well as whether that card is banned in any format. Modern currently has a robust ban list consisting of 44 cards. Alright, so how do you go about building a deck for Modern? The first question you should ask is, what kind of deck do you want to play? Most Modern decks can be broken down into one of the following categories. Aggro decks, whose strategy is to win as quickly as possible rather than emphasize a long-term game plan. Combo decks, whose strategy is to play cards which interact with one another in such a way as to produce a result, usually a game-ending one, that is far more powerful and impactful than the effect of either card in isolation. Control decks, whose strategy is to dominate over the long term of the game, using resource denial and card advantage. Mid-range, which is a style somewhere between aggro and control, using ramp and control early game, then typically bringing out threats mid-game or around turns 4 to 6. Tempo is a different style, also using both aggro and control to gain incremental card and mana advantage so as to outpace your opponent. There are, of course, many additional archetypes of decks in the format, and some can be described as a hybrid of one or more. In fact, classifying what type of deck you play is a bit of a rabbit hole that many Modern players can go down, and it's actually fun to go down sometimes. Like a wine taster describing the bouquet of their wine in complex descriptors, so too can a Modern player stick their nose into their favorite deck and say, Death and Taxes. This is a prison-style mid-range deck with a wonderful flutter of white weenie aggro and just a hint of control on the undertone. But when starting the format, it is a good idea to look at the decks in a more broad sense and see which style interests you most. But you can't just approach Modern by asking, what style of deck do I love to play, and then building one of those. Modern is a competitive format. Don't you need to ask which decks are the very best and then just build one of those? No, actually, and it's a huge misconception. The best deck in Modern is not what you think. What is the best deck in Modern? What if I told you it doesn't matter? Modern is thought of as a competitive format, but those that follow the pros will know that many found the format to be frustrating from a competitive standpoint. For all its intensity of gameplay, Modern is a format where many decks simply lose to certain matchups or certain game-ending sideboard cards, and this led many pros to lament that the format often had a quality of rock, paper, scissors to it that some disliked. Sometimes your matchup is just bad, and you lose. But therein lies what I, as a casual, find to be the best part of Modern. Because of this, every deck in Modern has a weakness. Every deck has a bad matchup or a sideboard answer to go after for when they are faced with their own bad matchup. The emphasis soon lands on the skill of the player to pilot their own deck, more so than the deck simply being the best or most expensive one at the table. For example, I am known for loving Merfolk, and I'd argue that since I know my deck inside and out, despite it not being the best of the best, it can beat the best of the best if I pilot it better than my opponent. It's how a deck like Merfolk, an arguably bad deck, kept having numerous top 8 finishes, won several GPs, and even took fellow YouTuber Nikachu all the way to the very finals of the entire tournament up against the brilliant Josh Utter-Layton. While Nikachu ultimately lost that match, he went incredibly far with what so many would call a non-top tier deck. And I would argue that it was Nikachu's extreme skill of play and knowledge of how his deck worked that helped bring him so far. Truly, Modern is a format where learning your deck and piloting it better than your opponent can be enough to overcome even the worst of matchups. See Modern Blue Tron, of which literally an entire textbook has been written by one of its biggest and most enthusiastic players. I'll of course link that in this video's description. Another example of this would be Jund. Modern Jund is not the best deck there is, but it is a very good deck, B+. However, Jund players know their deck like the back of their hand. They are devoted to it, and in a matchup that maybe technically isn't in their favor on paper, an experienced Jund player can pilot their deck to victory. This is what I love about Modern. You really can play what you love, and while not always true, knowing that deck you love and how it works can go a long way towards victory. The often rock, paper, scissors style of matchup that some expert players have at times derided, to me, is one of the format highlights, because it means that even weird rogue brews and tier 2s always have a shot in Modern. So let's talk about taking that shot. Building your first deck. One of the best online resources for Modern is the MTG Goldfish site, where you can see what decks are performing well, the top played cards in each or just in the format, as well as find a huge host of budget brews that can have you up and playing quickly and affordably. My biggest advice for anyone new to the format is to look at a strong budget build and begin getting in games, seeing what decks are out there and discovering your options. If you find a deck you fall in love with, you can begin building towards it, or you may simply like your starter deck so much that you'll look into upgrade options. Some of the easiest and most affordable Modern decks to begin building are aggro. Basic mono red burn or goblins can be put together for well under $100. Their mana bases being very basic mountains, and their race to the finish line being strong enough to handle most of what you might encounter jamming games with friends or playing at an in-store event. What's great is that both have upgrade options should you fall in love with their style, and if something bigger and more complex strikes your fancy, they can remain as a great spare deck to have around for friends to play with, or just days when you feel like playing spells and turning cards sideways. days. For the combo lovers, Storm can be put together on a very small budget as well. Storm in particular might be one of the best budget builds in the entire format right now. For Control, Dredge has some very potent budget offerings. And as I mentioned earlier, the often overlooked Mono Blue Tron will give you a deck of distinction and can be put together on a shoestring if needed, as it is mostly very affordable and classic control spells at this point, with a multitude of budget finishers, though none more effective in common than your opponent just scooping up in frustration. And I also tend to say that most mono-color modern decks are great starting points. Mono-green Elves or Stompy can be done for cheap, or just finding some lists where cutting out the fetch lands, which are often the most expensive part of a modern deck, will allow for a slightly suboptimal but still playable build. However, with the current reprinting of the enemy fetch lands in Modern Horizons 2, we are already witnessing prices to plummet. Now is the best time to enter into Modern as a result of this, or perhaps a week from now. And given the extreme versatility of fetch lands, someone getting a handful now might find they are the most reliable and resilient Modern staples there are. But before you buy anything, I recommend you just print out and proxy up a handful of decks to get practice games in with a friend. Don't spend a dime beyond paper and ink, and play with whatever decks you like, or just test out what you're interested in before you buy. You can also use this method to print up a deck library or gauntlet for testing and future practice games, something I cover here. Getting actual games. The most obvious place to play Modern is at your local game store, and with many safely reopening, checking your store's Facebook or other social media should show you a calendar of events. But if you aren't yet able to return to in-person gameplay, the fabulous Spell Table has added 1v1 support. In addition to Modern, you can now search for games in client of Pauper, Legacy, Vintage, Standard, or, that newfangled Commander format. I have an entire video about getting set up and running on Spell Table, and this new ability to not only play 1v1 formats such as Modern, but to search for games in client is simply a fabulous addition. Finally, though it may not be pretty, Magic Online does offer a robust and competitive Modern community, complete with LGS-like tournaments and, unlike Arena, the ability to just buy the cards for the decks you want and play them. And then, when you are done, sell or trade those cards to, get your money or much of it back, or just trade into decks you'd now like to play. No endless grinding and locked card library required. While Magic Online is a very basic interface, it is the closest digital version of Magic the Gathering by far, and another great modern resource. So there you have it. Print out a gauntlet of decks to test with, pick a deck or style of deck that you enjoy, identify your budget, sleeve up, and play. With programs like Spell Table, you can do this without ever leaving your home, and get games with players from all over the world. I hope very much this video has been of some interest to you. Interested in playing other Magic the Gathering formats? Check out my videos on Pioneer, Commander, and Gladiator here, and in this video's description. Be sure to hit subscribe, click that bell, and share with a friend, but most of all, just sleeve up and get a game.
Can I call you back? I just ran into an old friend. Professor! You paisley old rogue!
Teferi, you guy that I like.